Kemetic How-To Guide for Egyptian pagan and Kemetic practitioners. I'm your host, Sharon. Well, it's been a very long, hard semester. It's finally over, and to blow off some steam, I figured I would go to the movies. So earlier in December 2014, I went to go and see Exodus, Gods and Kings. Now, a friend of mine, who knows about my persuasions, said, well, you know, this isn't going to go well for the Egyptians. And I told him, duh. That's about like telling someone sitting down to watch Titanic, you know, the boat's gonna sink. But that's not what we go to watch movies like this for. That's certainly not why I go to see movies like this. I went to see Exodus with three things in mind. One, what were the set designs and the costumes going to be like? Two, what kind of historical blunders were they going to make? Because, unfortunately, you can count on them getting more things wrong than getting right. But three, what themes were they going to work into the story? Because, face it, the story of the Exodus has been told a few times by now, and there are different iterations with each telling. So let's start off with number one, costumes and set designs. The supporting cast, if you watch this movie, the priests and the scribes, had some pretty accurate garb. It looked pretty good. Actually, a lot of their stuff looked better than Rameses himself. There's a scene where you see Rameses newly crowned as pharaoh, and it looked like somebody might have been thinking about the dual crown, but they only got the bottom part of it, and it wasn't even red. So, strike there. Another odd thing I noticed is that in the first half of the movie, everyone has very nice bead collars and other stuff that, looked like they had gotten it from somebody in Egypt. But then the second half of the movie, the collars and other accoutrements looked like somebody's grandmother had put them together. I don't know. I'm not sure if they were filming this out of order, and so at the time that they were doing the second half, they were waiting for all the cool stuff from Egypt to come in the mail, or what it was. But either way, unfortunately, Ramesses' garb didn't look as good. And that's a shame, because he's the king, he's the head bad guy. And I'm always looking at movies like this and comparing them mentally to Cleopatra from, I believe, 1963 was when it came out. And, of course, Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, which came out in 1956. Many have tried, but none have succeeded to match the hotness of Yul Brynner's Rameses. If you haven't, then you owe it to yourself to watch it. There's some very interesting tidbits about the Ten Commandments on the Wikipedia article. I recommend that you go and check that out, too. A lot of very historically informed things that they did in that movie, which, unfortunately, I guess they didn't have the budget for that in Exodus, Gods and Kings. They were spending more of that money on digital effects and rotoscoping. But either way, and of course, Christian Bale just kind of looked like he ripped off a Roman SCA closet and then had Lucius Fox customize it for him. I exaggerate a little bit, but his stuff looked kind of out of place. Either way, now the Midianites and Zipporah had some very interesting ethnic garb going, facial tattoos and some other things. That was a really interesting little sidebar. And as for the sets, and this is going to kind of lead into the historical blunders bit. For one, okay people, for the last time, Rameses built no pyramids. The Hebrews built no pyramids. And of course in the scenes, the vistas that you see in a couple of different shots, they're showing pyramids under construction. Old Kingdom people, Middle Kingdom, not Ramesside period. Otherwise, yes, there was a lot of Roman influence, I think, in their sets. These big temple facades and staircases, and the beds and all that looked a little more Roman to me, but it was passable. It was interesting. Bit of trivia: the film was done mostly in Spain and the Canary Islands, I believe. If you do like me and you say and you watch all the credits, You've got long cast lists for location shots in Spain, and then the other location, the Canary Islands, and then there's a very short one for Egypt itself. And what that tells me is that you probably had a handful of folks go take some shots of some locations in Egypt, and then digitally composite them in with the stuff that they shot in Spain and elsewhere. So, historical blunders. I have to give them this point. They were setting this in Memphis as the capital, which, had it been any period other than the Ramesside period, they'd have been absolutely correct. That was the administrative capital of the country. Thing is, Ramesses, or perhaps his father Seti I, had moved the capital to closer to their hometown in the delta of Avaris. That's where P. Rameses, House of Ramesses, comes from. A few minutes into the film, you see a priestess, and she's reading entrails from a goose. That is a haruspice. Haruspice is the reading of entrails. This was done by the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Etruscans, and the Romans. The Egyptians didn't really. We don't have a lot of evidence for them reading from entrails, and certainly not. She's in front of a statue of Sekhmet, and cutting this thing open. You've got the blood dripping there. That's not proper Egyptian practice, because blood was an unclean substance, and you certainly don't want to be letting blood in front of Sekhmet. She mentions a deity that she calls Kebeshet, which I think they might have been referring to Kebehut, she of the cool waters, who was a daughter of Anubis, mostly referred to in a funerary context, not necessarily associated with the Nile, which is what you have in the movie. But again, they were trying there. Certain things that you see in the movie that would not have been used or done in that time period. Clear glass. They did not have clear glass. Using leeches for medical purposes. That was more of a medieval practice, not Bronze Age. Hanging people as a form of execution. Not really done so much in Egypt. If they were going to execute you, they were going to either burn you alive or impale you on a stake. Fun. Another thing, and this was something that had me just go, oh, come on. There's a point where you actually see Ramesses. Incidentally, he's played by Joel Edgerton. Those of you who are Star Wars fans might know him from Episode 3 as a very young Uncle Owen. So he went from the Tatooine Desert to the Egyptian desert, go figure. But they show him actually catch a cobra and milk it. And my husband and I were in the theater, and we're just like, oh, come on. They wouldn't have done that. And certainly not with, again, a clear glass. No, that was pure Hollywood. Now, some other interesting historical issues, and these really put the story in a different light if you look at it. Sigourney Weaver plays Tuya, who was Ramesses' mother, and in this movie she's kind of scheming and she wants Moses out of the way. Well, there's a problem with this. She'd have been dead at that point, because we know that when Seti came to the throne, he was a widower. Ramesses' mother had died before he became king. Now here's what's interesting. He had artists go into their tomb and go to her images and place the royal cobra on her head as a way of posthumously making her queen. And, that's frankly seems rather classy, that he remembered her and he, wanted to honor her in that way. Another interesting thing that none of the movies have picked up on is we know that Seti wanted to see his son king, and he knew that, under ordinary circumstances, Ramesses would become king after he was dead. He said, no, I don't want to wait for that. So he had Rameses II crowned as co-regent alongside him because, and it says in the monuments, he wanted to live to see his son king, which is directly opposite the way Rameses is portrayed in this movie, where Seti is not really sure about how well his son will do, and saying that he wished that Moses could have been, could have succeeded him. That's, again, pure Hollywood. And more on that. I do talk about the Exodus in Following the Sun. This book, is one of my major intentions with this book was to give you some historical reference, and especially in relation to some of the controversies like that one. Since some people have said, well, you didn't put any footnotes in here, you're going to get video footnotes now. One of a very good, just general source for the Exodus and its place in the Egyptian record, something that kind of goes over the controversy, is in Religion and Magic in Ancient Egypt by Rosalie David. Very nice lady. I actually emailed her a couple of times. But on 266, she has a whole chapter dealing with the Exodus. Another book, because one of the things that I talk about is that in New Kingdom Egypt, you had an institution that was called the Cap, and that was a school where the children of the pharaoh, but also very, very high officials, and the children of vassal states, including Nubia, would have gone to school. We have a lot of documented evidence of the children of Nubian chieftains going to school in the Cap, and the idea was that they would learn Egyptian customs, and because they would go to school with the future pharaoh and other future administrators, they would be more loyal to them. That's discussed in two sources. First of all, Tutankhamun, Life and Death of a Pharaoh, by Christiane Desroches-Noblecourt. She's French. Starting on page 120, she explains what the Cap is, and how that factored in Tutankhamun's time, because there were, several viceroys of Nubia from his time that we know about. Another excellent book. The exhibit for this one was wonderful, and I recommend the book. Hatshepsut from Queen to Pharaoh, edited by, because there are multiple contributors to it, and edited by Catherine Roerig. The article in question here is Egypt and Nubia, Conflict with the Kingdom of Kush, by W. Vivian Davies. I think you'll also see her just credited as Vivian Davies. And this also explains how Nubia was acculturated. And we can assume that if you had a child from a group of Asiatics living in northern Egypt, if Moses was in the court of Pharaoh, that's probably where he was in the Cap, which meant that yes, he grew up alongside other Egyptians and learned Egyptian ways, but it's quite likely that he knew the whole time that he was not Egyptian himself, and that kind of counters what you see in this movie, which gets into some of the themes from Exodus, Gods and Kings. There's, for one, they have a revelation when Moses, again played by Christian Bale, which kind of made it funny. There's this reaction, oh, he's Hebrew? And I'm going, no, he's not. He doesn't even look it. But it was kind of referring, I think, this movie draws themes and makes references to the Holocaust, because you have this shocking revelation, oh my God, somebody's Hebrew. You might have said, oh my God, they're Jewish. Yeah, it's the same thing. But most strikingly, there is a point where Egyptian soldiers are going through the slave quarters, and they're looking for Moses and his kin, and they're hidden in a room basically in the basement of this house. And, of course, Ben Kingsley, tries to lead the soldiers off. And you might as well have been having a family and hiding in an attic in Europe in the 1940s. It was the same kind of, thing. So it makes sense, that they're referring to that, because they're, in effect, making a comparison between, the Holocaust and, this period that was, reputed to have been a persecution of the Hebrews. With Exodus, Gods and Kings, it's a modern movie for a modern time, a much more cynical audience, and they're trying to convey a religious theme, and it's a tough sell, so they kind of tread lightly with that. One thing that was rather interesting was you have God appear as a little kid that only Moses sees or talks to. And the little kid, it's interesting because it's kind of minimalist but a little creepy at the same time, which, considering this is Old Testament, maybe that works. But there's certain things that they kind of, they're looking ahead, trying to, again, present a religious tale to a modern audience, but in the process they step backward. Because one thing that did bother me is you had the Viceroy of Pithom. He was this obviously effeminate and corrupt official, and that seemed a bit rich to me. Of course the shifty gay guy is going to be, corrupt and a bad guy. Aren't we a little past that? Having an obviously or stereotypically gay character as one of your bad guys. The other thing, of course, is an impression that I get is, of course, those nasty polytheists believe in goddesses and listen to priestesses and do divination because good monotheists or good biblical characters, the women, they get their faith from their men, like Zipporah did, right? There are some themes in there that are kind of obvious. And, of course, they're always going to portray the Egyptians as fairly faithless people. But that's because in order to make you obviously sympathetic for the Hebrews, then you have to, because the minute you portray Egyptians sincerely praying to their gods and saying, why is this happening to us, then you start to call into question the whole motivation for the Exodus story. And they almost do that at one point, because you see Rameses, and this is the one point in the story where you really feel sorry for him, when he's holding his dead son and standing in front of Moses, and he says, what kind of people would pray to a God who does this, who kills children? And I was kind of surprised they did that, but he kind of speaks for a lot of the questions that people have. In all fairness, somebody could also say, well, why is it that you have a goddess like Sekhmet, who is the mistress of plagues, and she sends her messengers out and causes destruction? Is that any better or worse than Old Testament Jehovah? I throw that out for discussion. I think it's an interesting point. Why is one more preferable to the other? But if you get a chance to see this movie, then go ahead. There certainly aren't any complaints from the North Koreans about this movie. There's also two other movies that are in the theater right now that have an Egyptian theme. As a matter of fact, the USA Today actually covered this in their December 3rd, 2014 issue. They have No Denial, Ancient Egypt Rules Holiday Films. Here's an interesting bit of trivia. In the third Night at the Museum movie, you actually have an Egyptian actor playing an Egyptian character, Rami Malek. And that's unusual, but we need to see more things like this. And for those folks who have raised the issue of race in these movies, and that they seem whitewashed, I'm kind of inclined to agree that the supporting cast, you got a lot more of an ethnic mix, but your main characters, they're, fairly straight up white dudes. One thing, though, that I can suggest, knowing a few folks that work in Hollywood, if you want to see more people in movies that are not, standard fare, then they go for star power when they're writing and when they're casting these things. If they get somebody cool, say, well, we got Ben Kingsley, we got Christian Bale. Other people will jump onto that movie because of that. So, what you ought to do, my suggestion is, write and say, hey, I want to see Morgan Freeman, Sidney Poitier, Halle Berry, people like that in these movies. Because we live in a day and age where a fan base for an actor, that can help get them roles. I mean, that's why we have Peter Cullen, the original voice of Optimus Prime, in the Michael Bay movies, as opposed to George Clooney, who they were originally going to cast. A lot of people said, no. Some were very emphatic about it. So that's, we live in a day and age where you can do that. I love it whenever things like this come up because, hey, it gets more discussion going about ancient Egypt and about, their religion and, what do we think of it now? And, something interesting to keep in mind, the Church of the Eternal Source was founded by a bunch of folks who saw The Egyptian in theaters in 1954 and then decided to start a club. So, with that in mind, for the Kemetic How-To Guide, this is your host Sharon, wishing you Senepti.